This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. Welcome back to Political Theater. We're going to talk about the film War Game in this episode. And no, it's not War Games, the classic 1983 movie where Matthew Broderick almost blows up the world. This is War Game singular, and it's about something very immediate, the upcoming election and the aftermath, and what would happen if a disputed election leads to violence on January 6th. With us to discuss is Jesse Moss, the co-director, and Janessa Goldbeck, retired Marine involved in the planning of the simulated exercise at the heart of the film. Jesse, Janessa, welcome to Political Theater.
Thanks so much for having us.
Jesse, let's start with you, because in your director statements and you talk about like how you learned about this project. Let's just talk about the project that led to the movie War Game, and then we'll get into some of the planning and go to Janessa about some of the specifics of what went into this. But let's talk about just what it is. The movie is about...
The movie is about a war game conducted by Janessa's organization that contemplates the next insurrection on January 6, 2025. So it's a documentary about the future. It's kind of a paradox, but that excited me. It's inspired by an editorial op-ed in the Washington Post by 3 retired generals who said, we need to look at this scenario, at this possibility that the next insurrection, the next disputed election could result in political violence and be worse than what we experienced in 2021. And when I learned about Janessa's organization taking up the challenge posed by these generals, I thought, what a fascinating way to confront our possible political future.
And that organization is the Vet Voice Foundation. Janessa, do you want to talk about that and the organization and how it started planning this simulation of what could go wrong on January 6th?
Yeah, absolutely. Vet Voice Foundation is a 501c nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We represent about 1.5 million veterans and military family members across the country. And our mission is to elevate their voices in our democracy. So that ranges from helping folks learn how to impact policy and get policies passed in their local community all the way up to the federal level. It involves some impact litigation. And when we saw this op-ed written by these 3 retired generals that not only were talking about the potential for political violence, but in particular, the role of extremism in the active duty armed forces and the concern that potentially you could have active duty members of the military or National Guard participating in a future insurrection. We wanted to look at that piece in particular. There's a lot of great work being done in Washington, D.C. and across the country on threats to democracy, the slide towards authoritarianism, but not a lot of emphasis attention was being paid from our perspective to the concern about extremism in the military itself. We know that 1 in 5 of the defendants in the January 6th cases were veterans, which is vastly disproportional to our size in American society. So that's really what got our wheels turning. And we thought, well, look, we've got this incredible network of former policymakers and retired military and security experts. Why don't we bring them together and game this out in a tabletop or war game?
Right. And we're talking about some pretty heavy hitters and readily identifiable people, at least for those of us in the political world. You have former Montana Governor Steve Bullock playing the President of the United States. You got former Senator Doug Jones playing the Attorney General, actually a role that people have bandied about in the event of a Kamala Harris administration, that he might be, in fact, tapped to be a future Attorney General. You got Wesley Clark playing the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's retired 4-star former Supreme Commander of NATO, or Allied. I forget his exact title, but 4-star
Supreme Allied Commander of NATO.
Yes,
quite a mouthful.
Yes, and a former presidential candidate himself. Former Senator Heidi Heitkamp is the Chief of Staff for the White House Chief of Staff. We could go on. There's several people. More. You got some retired flag officers. You've got some former people who were in the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Council. So these are not just actors, although they became actors for this in a way. What were those conversations like to get them on board to do this? Because I could imagine some people, particularly those who may think that they have a little bit more of a political future, being a little hesitant to be under that kind of scrutiny with a camera in their face, making decisions like that. What were these conversations like, getting them on board?
Well, I will say you're absolutely right. This took quite a bit of courage from all of the participants, not only because they were agreeing to appear on camera for an unscripted exercise that, they had some big blue arrows about what we were going to be examining, but they didn't have a lot of details. And also, the subject matter has become so polarizing in this country to talk about extremism within the active duty forces that people who have stepped out and stepped up to talk about this topic have been targeted by extremist groups online and in the real world. So this was a real act of moral and physical courage for all of these people who agreed to participate. And, I was a little bit concerned at first. We told everyone in advance that there would be cameras in the room, that we were filming this for a documentary. And I think, like most people, they assumed it would be maybe 3 guys with tripods, in a windowless conference room. And actually what they walked into on January 6th, 2022, or 2022, right? 2023, when we shot this, thank you, Jesse, was an incredible set that Jesse and his team put together that really felt like the White House Situation Room, that really felt like the White House briefing room. And I think that actually elevated the play of this scenario, the play of the game, because as soon as we hit go on that big red button and the countdown began, they were in it 100%.
And I also, Jesse, the decision to stage some of this outside of that Situation Room, the simulation where you have a couple of vet voice participants, who are in the red cell, who are being the antagonists. You take them to the Capitol, basically scoping it out, and you take them to National Airport where they're, smoking cigarettes and taking pictures and, just doing all kinds of things that make you a little uneasy when you see how, the access that, people have, the proximity that they have to the Capitol. Talk a little bit about that discussion, because it opens the film and it's kind of unnerving because it's like, is this a documentary? Is this fictionalized? Several documentarians will use such, sort of simulated or fictitious like scenarios, but it's because of the verisimilitude of the situation, it felt very uneasy. Talk about your decision to do that.
Well, that's one of the things that made this exercise so interesting, was that to organize it, Janessa had recruited former veterans, Marine and Army veterans, who portrayed this opposition force, the Red Cell. And they have built a kind of fictional, but based on reality, extremist movement in which these members of the military who defect, these extremists, are allied with this group. It's called the Order of Columbus in the film. It's entirely fictional, but recognizable, I think, to viewers. Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, and various other extremist factions. And the guys who came together, who Janessa brought in, are incredibly compelling, and they have real combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. They have investigated extremist movements now since their service, and this is a important work for them. And when we meet them in the film, they're actually scouting Capitol Hill for its tactical weaknesses, and it's actually a very real scene. We don't, the audience, really know what's going on, and there's some kind of intentional I wouldn't say confusion, but that the dramatic space that the film operates in is unusual, I think, by the standards of documentary. It's improvisational theater, it's dystopian science fiction, and it's very much documentary, all of those things. And the audience is invited in. And what was thrilling for me, and I think for audiences, is the space is the White House Situation Room, that windowless conference room in the White House where the president manages grave national crises. We are invited in to sit at that table with these advisors played by these very credible people you mentioned. And what also made it fascinating for me is that this is a bipartisan and nonpartisan group. It's a rare space in American political life where we see people with different politics and points of view actually coming together to try to do something in concert. And that was really exciting to me, to be in that space, to watch them work together. Elizabeth Newman, a veteran of the Trump administration, plays a Homeland Security advisor. So we had this, the Oath Keepers, the Order of Columbus, the sort of fictional Oath Keepers, have their own HQ in the film. It's looks like a cop bar, but it's where they orchestrate their extremist uprising. And there's also a simulated White House briefing room. So it's a very elaborate play space that the cameras move in and out of, and the audience gets to move in and out of. And we also see what's called the control room, where Janessa and her fellow consultants, Colonel Alex Vindman, and others are there sort of making sure this train stays on the tracks.
Janessa, how did you feel about being not just helping plan the simulation, but then also having a couple of roles? You're one of the, as Jesse just said, one of the kind of control or game masters, if you will. I guess if people are into D&D and stuff like that, it would be a dungeon master almost. And then you're also the voice of the governor of Arizona. I'm an Arizonan, so that caught my eye. That you were portraying the governor. Talk about like what that was like to be not just a kind of pulling this exercise together, but participating in it too.
Well, I certainly didn't realize I would be playing the governor of Arizona until about 30 seconds before I jumped on the mic. But, as Jesse said, a lot of this was improvisation, and we had, thought through who people were going to need in the room. And so there were about 35 role players. There were also some folks who were, as Jesse said, in the control room with me advising. So we had former, Capitol Police actually in the control room. So some of the tactical things that were happening in the game, they were able to provide us with that law enforcement response in a realistic way. But we couldn't prepare for everything that they would need or ask for. And one of our actual really big takeaways from the exercise itself, one of our learnings, was how important it was for local leaders, state leaders, governors, secretaries of state, AGs, to understand and really have familiarity with the Insurrection Act in particular. And when we created this scenario and when we shot the film, we didn't know that the far right flank of this country was going to put out a dossier called Project 2025 that actually recommends the use of the Insurrection Act by a future President Trump to police cities and states of political rivals, to deploy active duty military forces via the Insurrection Act into places like Chicago and Arizona, and to use the Insurrection Act to deport people who are supposedly here illegally, which are massive breaks from what we've come to expect in terms of civil-military relations in this country, and something that the majority of Americans are not in support of. But we really wanted to tease out the Insurrection Act and what would happen if a president employed it, in this case, a president who's trying to quell a political insurrection, but had to face the feature of potentially having forces that are disloyal in the National Guard that would be deploying into the streets. So it's now even more relevant, I think, than it was. The question is even more relevant than it was when we filmed. The Insurrection Act has taken on a much graver feature in American political and public life. And so I'm grateful that we were able to do that. And I'm grateful that audiences are invited into the conversation and really have an opportunity to learn about the Insurrection Act, to understand why leaders are hesitant to use it or might be encouraged to use it, and be part of that conversation.
Yeah, I was struck at the real sort of psychological tension. I mean, there's the the tactical and strategic questions, right? Of like how what to do in what situation, if there's a hostage situation, if there's a security breach, and so forth. And then, as you said, Janessa, you get into the legal and ethical and moral implications of legislation, of the Insurrection Act. I've joked with a lot of my colleagues over the years that everybody really should know the term, what posse comitatus means, and we joke about it like that most people don't, but we are in a situation where, as you said, Project 2025 has said in writing, this is what President Trump should do. He should invoke the Insurrection Act. And so it's incumbent upon policy leaders, local, state, federal officials, and just regular citizens to understand the implications of this, because it's not abstract at all any longer.
That's right. And one of the exciting things about this project is, not only was a film in theatrical release, but we have been a part of an impact tour around the country over the last few months. 2 weeks ago or last week, we were out in rural Pennsylvania, did a screening with the governor of Pennsylvania, and had a conversation with an audience of, packed audience hall, 400 people, about some of these things that are raised in the film. And I'll be back in Pennsylvania next week doing a state level exercise with a bunch of journalists and policymakers to talk through some of these issues. But it is, it is a frightening precipice that we are on the verge of. And it's important that we're having these conversations, not just in Washington, but in our communities and in our homes.
They say when a problem reaches the president's desk, that it's a particularly thorny one. And I think what we see in the film is, as you're saying, Jason, there's no easy answer for our president, our fictional president in this war game, to determine what to do. And I think ultimately the film leaves audiences with that question. And I've enjoyed polling audiences, and they're pretty evenly split on whether or not the president should invoke or shouldn't invoke the Insurrection Act to quell this uprising. And then the crucial difference in our scenario in this war game is that the insurrection spreads around the country. It moves beyond the U.S. Capitol to the state of Arizona and other places.
And one of the things that struck me also is that having, been in Washington on January 6, 2021, and managing a teams, of people who are in the Capitol, the memories are very vivid for me. And I think a question that a lot of people have is, why wasn't the, Capitol Police response more violent, when they were being approached? And your film addresses this. Several people in the simulation address what happens when you escalate. And I think I'm curious your thoughts about how, like, it to me, it seems like a very, almost a knee-jerk reaction. Well, of course you should put down something really quickly and really violently when people attack the Capitol. But one of Chris Jones, one of your fellow veterans, Janessa, he says at one point, when you start shooting at insurgents, you lose. And this is from somebody who's been boots on the ground dealing with insurgents. And I just was really struck by that. And it made me sort of rethink what my own memories and my own reactions about January 6, 2021, when thinking about that. Talk a little bit about that, how like that, it's almost counterintuitive. It's to de-escalate situations like this.
Yeah, I think what you see portrayed on screen is people who are being extraordinarily thoughtful. They're bringing their decades of experience, some in combat, some in government, to the table. And, General Clark tells a story about Waco, Texas, and what happened there, and how that deeply shapes his advice to the president. And you see what it looks like to have thoughtful, reasoned, measured people who care about the future of our democracy sitting at the table. And I think a lot of times we we hear about decision making that happens at the highest levels of government when things have gone terribly wrong or gone off the rails. And it's hopeful to actually watch people who care and who are trying to make the best decisions they can with limited and imperfect information. And with that spirit of what happens the next day, the day after. And it also really makes you think how terrifying it is to have people who don't have those intentions sitting at that decision-making table.
Yeah. Jesse, you were also the director of Girls State and Boys State. And as someone who's been in student government dating back to my early years in high school and so forth, I was very struck by those movies. I think that you may have talked to one of our reporters here at Roll Call about Boys State back in 2020. I almost see this movie as a continuum of Boys State and Girls State. Like, talk about that a little bit.
I think very much so. I mean, I think those projects, those films, Boys State, Girls State, and War Games, stem from a sort of single desire of mine to have a political conversation with myself and hopefully with an audience that has something fresh to offer. And I think we're inundated with political news and information. We're traumatized by what we've lived through too. It's sometimes difficult to confront some of the legacy of the Trump years and January 6, 2021. And what I loved about those movies is that they made me laugh. They're about young people. I think they deal with hard stuff, but in a refreshing way. And when I learned about Janessa's exercise, this war game, I didn't think it would be funny, and it's not very funny. I wish it were, but it's fresh. It's a new way of it reframes a conversation and invites people in from different political perspectives to consider this scenario, and is not prescriptive. And I think that excited me, and it's formally inventive, if I can say that. I think it excited me about watching people like Heidi Heitkamp act, but actually play herself. Could they do it? It was terrifying. We had to raise the money before we knew whether this whole exercise would be compelling film. And it wasn't until the camera started rolling and this 6-hour real-time exercise started, and we had an 80-person crew, that we knew whether this would be interesting to watch. And I got to say, it was transfixing from moment one, and didn't stop, because we don't know the outcome. But suddenly, these people, some of whom we knew were charismatic, they'd run for president, like Wes Clark and Steve Bullock, but we didn't know they could step into these chairs. And they instantly had a kind of chemistry and charisma that made me feel like I was in the room with people who really knew what they were talking about. And it had a kind of a tension of narrative cinema with a little Dr. Strangelove thrown into it for good measure. And that's all that I can offer. We've had a lot of postmortem on January 6, 2021, and really good documentaries and journalism and the J6 committee. But I think we need new ways to talk about what the legacy of those events are. They're obviously contested, but also as we think about the future in this country. And that's what I hope this film offers.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize too that to the listeners that the 6 hours, allotted for this exercise, that was the filming time, and it's an hour and a half film. It's an hour and a half long film, so it doesn't last 6 hours. It's not an Andy Warhol, avant-garde movie, but it is. I mean, it is tense, and I kept on thinking, the music, the score really helps. It really does drive up the blood pressure, if you will. But I wanted to ask both of you, as Jesse, you're behind the camera, and Janessa, you're in front of it for a lot of the film. What was the tension like that? Like, approximately, what was it like being there? Because it feels incredibly tense, and the music gets more and more tense as you see the clock almost like in 24, counting down. What was the tension like in the room? Because it's obviously spread over another 6 hours, but again, people have to make decisions. Boom, boom, boom. And was it as stressful as it seemed?
Yeah, absolutely. I compared my day to, it felt like I was, coaching both teams in the Super Bowl and also producing the Super Bowl show at the same time. Like that's how I felt in terms of pressure. And, we had in the White House briefing room that Jesse and his team built for the players to go out and make statements to the media. We had a bunch of chairs in there, just like the real White House Situation Room, and we'd invited organizational partners, supporters, even some members of Congress that we have, close relationships with, to come in over the course of the day and sit in those chairs. And there was a live feed from the Situation Room in the White House briefing room. And we thought people would drop by for like 20 minutes or, an hour and check it out. Just cool to be on a movie set. Those people sat in those chairs for the entire exercise. And then they came to the bar after, where we had a little post-exercise reception, and they wanted to debrief right then and there with all of the participants, because it was so compelling. And we were, this was an incredible feat of filmmaking. As Jesse said, there's an 80-person crew. Everyone is mic'd. So there's multiple live feeds going on at the same time. So it wasn't until I actually watched the first cut of the film that I saw a lot of the conversations that had happened, because they maybe hadn't been on the main feed or on the monitors that we were monitoring. So it was incredible. And Jesse has told me that there is a 6-hour cut out there somewhere, and maybe on the 10-year anniversary of War Game, we'll
maybe like Zack Snyder, you can also release it in its full length in black and white, or something.
I'd love to. You mentioned the Warhol sleep. I think the 6-hour, it maybe would only appeal to the true policy wonks out there, but there are a few of us, and it's a dream I have. I would say, what struck me in that day, first of all, it was January 6, 2023. And I think that date has had a meaning for everybody who was gathered, particularly the role players. Furthermore, the hotel itself had been a place where insurrectionists themselves had stayed. And so the hotel staff was sort of dealing with ghosts of that event that are kind of needed to be exorcised. And I think that the exercise itself did succeed in a way as a production of theater in sort of gathering these demons and sort of confronting them. And you feel that in the emotions in the room. I mean, they're behaving like human beings. They're not just apparatchik policy wonks. They're people with lived experience. You feel that. You feel tensions rise and conflicts and differences of temperament and policy. And there's a little bit of sort of post-mortem. We get to see that, things are not all settled neatly. And I like that we can leave the audience with hopefully an experience of kind of theater, because that's what they're watching, but also it's political theater. And I think that it's a new way of thinking about the legacy of January 6th.
And Janessa, there's also a component of this that goes beyond the film, which is that your organization and people affiliated with it have produced a confidential analysis of the simulation and delivered it to policymakers in hopes that they can learn something from it. So this is also not just for the theater of it and the narrative aspect of it, but actually for people to take something from it, like this is what happened in this situation. This is what could have gone better. And I think that it almost, you had a little bit of real time there too of it at the end of the film. When some of the folks were rightfully saying like, hey, I think we learned this and that and so forth. And one of your former veteran colleagues says, I wish I could be happier, and then he just sort of delivers it like it's it's like a relatively polite, but blunt critique of like, there's a lot more here that you need to think about.
Yeah, the report was the original deliverable for this project. But we also knew that, a lot of reports get delivered to Congress. A lot of reports go to the White House and agencies. And there's really no accountability beyond that, right? It's like a thank you so much, we'll take a look. And so we wanted from the start for there to be some measure of public accountability for this project. And at first, the thought was, well, maybe we would, invite like a news crew in. But once we started getting 4-star generals and former senators saying yes, we became concerned that we would have no sort of ability to control what was written about. And one of our strongest values going into this project was to do no harm. We didn't want to put something out into public spaces that inspired people with bad intent. And when we started talking to Jesse and his co-director Tony, we really felt like this was, they would have complete artistic independence from us. They are documentary filmmakers, but we felt like there was a lot of trust and mutual respect in sharing the value of doing no harm and putting something out that might inspire someone to do something. So all of the things portrayed in the film are things that have really happened in our country in recent years, but we sort of just turned the dial up and smashed them all together into the country's worst day. But that was really important to have people involved in the project from start to finish who shared that ethos. Yeah.
And Janessa, you mentioned that you're kind of part of a road tour almost of the film. What is next? I mean, I know that you had a theatrical release, a general theatrical release, and it's streaming. Where can people see it if they want to watch it online?
I love it when a film can leap off the screen and into the audience, and we've been able to do that. Our role players, who are pretty busy folks, have actually been totally committed to being a part of the public conversation around this film, from our premiere at Sundance through our theatrical release, which is ongoing and started in early August. We've had screenings in maybe 40 American cities, and we're on college campuses and in swing states, and many of those screenings are with Governor Bullock, Senator Heitkamp, Colonel Vindman. I mean, just an incredible roster. And those conversations with audiences have been, to me, some of the most rewarding part of this journey, and really why we made the film. And so that conversation continues. And we have a website, wargamefilm.com, which has our theatrical and other bookings. And then we're available digitally now, thankfully, in homes across America via Apple TV and Amazon Prime. You can rent or buy the film and other digital platforms. And there's information on our website about that. So it's finally come to people's computers and living rooms, and also theaters. And because I think that, because it's a work of theater too, I think having a live audience for these screenings has sort of completed that aspect of the journey for us creatively. But I think it's a film that provokes conversation. Doesn't, as I said, it's not a prescriptive film, and so I hope people can find the film at home or wherever they'd like to.
And also, I just want to note that we have finally reached peak podcast. We have everything now because we have Janessa's cat in the background.
I actually had to go on mute for a second because my dog came over and just started drinking out of a giant jug of water. So
this is, talk about improvisational theater.
Right.
This is. I swear, Jesse and I didn't arrange that. So that we'd have that. No. Jesse, Janessa, thank you so much for talking about your movie, your work. This is a kind of an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, but I think it's a necessary topic to address. We are less than 1 month away from Election Day, and I think it's your project, the project and the film, all wrapped into one is quite an accomplishment. So thank you very much for doing it, and good luck for where you go from here with it.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.